Hello everyone, I am Duke and welcome to today's video. This time we'll be looking at some of the units I think we might see in the upcoming Temple of Metamorphosis release. Before we begin, I'd like to say that if you are new to the channel or the lore of TrenchCrusade, then welcome, and for my returning viewers, please drop me a like and share this video with a friend. Now, we don't actually know when the temple will be released, but with teasers on the website's rules section when we had the mysterious doorway appear, honestly I would be surprised if they didn't show off something for the faction at Nova Open, and whether that will be rules or lore I don't know, but let's have a look at what I think we might be getting for the faction on release. So the first thing I want to talk about isn't actually a Temple of Metamorphosis unit, but some lore for the faction as a whole. So this is Saint Dominica of the Zweihander, and the reason I bring her up is that we know she is a dead saint for the faithful nations. She was killed by one of these, a pupil seraph, at the Battle of Absalom. Now, from the small bit of lore that we have about Saint Dominica, she was killed by the pupil seraph when her charge into enemy lines faltered. Now, maybe that was a counter-attack, maybe it was a last stand scenario, we just don't know anything for sure yet. Although I would be really surprised if we got new lore for the Temple of Metamorphosis that didn't at least delve into the Battle of Absalom in a small way and explain what happened there. So I suppose in many ways my first prediction for the Temple of Metamorphosis is that we'll explore the Battle of Absalom and what occurred there, which means we might get a joint lore drop for the Temple of Metamorphosis and one of the faithful nations when that happens. And I say that because it wouldn't make sense for me to not release a few different lore drops along with the faction that shows them fighting either against or working with other forces in the setting. We are currently getting similar lore like that for the Path of the Beast, slowly fleshing out the faction, and I feel like having the temple release without a good number of short stories and lore drops, which, essentially contextualizes them in the wider setting, might seem a bit odd. Which leads me on to another point. I feel as though the temple will be released alongside an antagonistic faithful faction. Now this would give them both joint lore and reduce the workload for the small team at Factory Fortress. And that makes sense to me because they would probably be released opposing a faction like the Hebrew Knights or maybe even the Synod of Strategic Prophecy when they drop. Now, I mention the Synod because I think that would be a really interesting one, and I feel as though they probably fulfill the same role as the Temple for their respective factions. And I can just imagine these two sides fighting a war where they're trying to constantly second guess and predict each other with either the Word of God or Horospice, and that could be quite a good setup for some espionage and spy network styles of war. The other possibility I could see is that the Temple are predominantly operating outside of the map we currently see, either in the New World or opposing the Iron Sultanate from a less well-defended front. But with lore speculation put to one side for a moment, let's have a look at what units I think the faction might have and what rules they might be given. So first up, I want to talk about rules for the faction as a whole. As I said in a previous video about the doorway and the mysteries of the website, I feel as though the Temple of Metamorphosis and its connections to novels like Journey of the East might mean that they're the first faction to release without any weapons at all, or at least, not in the conventional sense. And if you saw my Path of the Beast video, you might have noticed that I dropped quite a few parallels between what I think their faction might get and what we currently have for the Trench Pilgrims and Heretic Legions. Well, unsurprisingly for the Temple of Metamorphosis, I think they'll function like a mix between the Iron Sultanate and the Court of the Seven-Headed Serpent. Now that doesn't mean that I think the temple will get goetic magic, I just think they'll have an ability to affect the tabletop with some level of future sight and, maybe the ability to affect rolls and probabilities. So how do I think that might look? For example, I could see something like using an enemy's blood markers to cause an effect not to have happened. So imagine for a second we're in a game and you shoot at one of my temple units. You wound it and kill it, but I can use, maybe 2 of your army's blood markers to reduce that result from an out of action to a down result, with the amount of blood markers needed increasing according to how strong the temple unit killed is. This would show them being able to predict what is about to happen, but in a bit of an imperfect way, so they can avoid being killed but not necessarily avoid the shot hitting them. Now, one way I can think of balancing that is if the model saved in that way is returned to the tabletop downed with 3 blood markers. That would effectively mean that you might not have actually saved it if the enemy can hit it again, but in certain circumstances, it could pull a game back from the brink for the temple players. As for their armoury, if I'm right and the temple don't use weapons, how we would think of them at least, I think a really interesting way to do that would be to give the faction the ability to be adapted like the Takwing creations of the Iron Sultanate. So say for example you get a base profile with a few options like having some kind of venom spitting attack at pistol range, or throwing spikes and stingers out at the range of something like a Warcross. Since this would make the faction a very close ranged faction, I'd imagine they get access to faster units and maybe more musical instruments to allow them to get into close range quicker. And I think that would lend itself really well to this bug and insect aesthetic that the temple as a whole has, and play into the themes of them being like skittering bug-like monsters, fast and agile but only really dangerous at close range. For armor, you could give them different carapaces, maybe hardened to give them the same effect as reinforced armor, or for close range you could give them stronger jaws or limb adaptations to make them faster or hit harder in melee. You could even extend this adaptability out to the datasheet of the unit in a limited capacity. Maybe some of the adaptations not only give the temple creature the strong keyword, but give it +1 dice in range or melee. Think of an adaptation like a set of crab claws being an anti-tank weapon at close range that needs the strength adaptation to wield it, making it an expensive investment like other similar weapons, but as a result it might ignore armor or get extra dice to injury. So moving on from general faction rules, I think we'll get 3 elites like most other factions, and the first will be, a monk or some sort of high priest for the temple. For their profile, I think like many other leader characters, they get +2 dice in melee and at range, but I don't think they will get tough. If I'm right about them being able to take different adaptations, then I could see a choice of either making them a golem or giving them the tough keyword with a different carapace. The choice of one would lock them out of having the choice of the other, but wouldn't mean you couldn't further protect them with some kind of armor plating. Considering the temple seems so able to change and alter their bodies as they worship the god of many forms, I wouldn't be surprised if they were the only faction to have a leader who can gain the golem keyword, and this would make them an incredible bullet sponge whether given the tough or golem keywords, but I don't think their abilities will end there. Similar to an observer, I think the monks will be agile and harder to hit at range and melee, and maybe even able to command another unit on the board to activate next, just like the observer's voice of god ability. Now for movement, I think that could depend on any different adaptations given to them. Maybe you could give them wings to add +2 to their movement and give them the fly keyword, or leave them ground based with something like an 8-inch move and an adaptation to give them +1 dice to dash. The next elite I think we'll see is an Acolyte of the Call. Now much like the second in command type unit, their profile is likely going to be a +1 range and melee, and I'd imagine a movement range or ability similar to the High Priest. One adaptation I can see being available to them specifically is to don the discarded carapace of their warband's leader that they left behind when they assumed their new form. This could grant the Acolyte one of the abilities of the leader for a single turn, or even grant them the tough keyword for example. As for a special ability of their own, I think they'll be able to support the other units of their faction, allowing them to either heal or give out blessing markers to their troops. This could even be adaptation dependent, meaning one person's warband could have a solid healer and another could hand out blessing markers to make their troops' abilities and attacks more likely. Thematically, those would both be explainable by the Acolyte being able to see the immediate future and warning a unit so it can avoid harm, or maybe even reversing time on a local level to heal a wound. Which brings me to the last of the 3 elites, and I find this one a bit harder to decide on. I think it could be this unit, a Strident Piper, which would make it one of the only musician units where their musical instrument is baked into their profile. Now imagine this as less of a attack and damaging character than things like a Hell Knight, Communicant or Assassin, but being more of a support role character, With a move of 10 inches and the fly keyword, it could be interesting if the piper allowed your forces to rapidly advance towards the enemy. So much like other musical instruments, it would grant a +1 to everyone's dashes in a particular range, but as an added ability it would be good to see them hand out an extra dice when charging, like the Shock Trooper's ability of new Antioch Stormtroopers. And again, this would play into that idea of the Temple being able to manipulate fate on the battlefield and increase the likelihood of their plans going accordingly. Considering this would be quite a powerful ability for a melee faction, I think there'd be a limit of 1 or 2 with a weaker profile to dissuade you from getting them into direct combat. Now, I think to make that reasonable, the profile should be unmodifiable, so 10-inch fly with +1 dice in melee, -1 dice at range, and only standard armor with no helmet options available, for example. That wouldn't make them particularly hard to kill, but it would make them quite a fast nuisance character when needed. In terms of troops, I wouldn't be surprised if the Temple got 2 units like other factions, with one being a stronger, more elite style unit and the other one being basic chaff. So for their more limited, more elite unit, I could see that being a sister of the Transcendent Crusade, which is the current image on screen, or something a bit more simple like a Temple Nun, which is this image up on screen now. Now, whichever one of those two it is, I think a suitable profile for them would be a +1 at range and melee like you often see with these type of units. Now, rather than being able to give them the strong keyword or something similar, I think they'll actually get a limited healing ability like a combat medic. This would lean into the idea of nuns and sisters of the Crusade being caretakers of the faction, looking out for new converts and nurturing the metamorphic vector, but also add some much needed durability to a faction that wants to get in close and into melee and is weak to ranged attacks. The other reason that I think the Temple could get a limited troop with some healing abilities is I don't think they'll have access to medkits, so having one baked into a profile could be quite useful. And for the chaff unit, I think we'll see something like a Transcendent Ascetic, which is the image up on screen now. Much like a Wretched, they would be -1 at range and melee, and probably have access to a limited range of adaptations or upgrades, making them quite a cheap throwaway unit to capture enemy objectives. Which brings me on to the last thing I want to talk about, and that is the heavy hitters of the faction, which I think will be the Ostiarii. Now, I don't know whether I'm saying that correctly, but they are massive by the looks of their artwork, and I think they could be the single largest unit in the game. But along with that, I wouldn't be surprised if, along with being tough, they were unable to be put down just like suits of machine armor, which would make sense due to their size. In melee and range, I think we'll see either a +2 and 0 or even a +3 and -1. The idea of that is with these being a melee monster that wouldn't need a ranged ability, but if they were to somehow be given a ranged attack, it should be harder to hit with it. As for their profile as a whole, I think the Ostiarii will again have armor and equipment that can't be adjusted just like Anchorites and Warwolves, but instead of the usual limit 1 we see with those units, I think there'll be a limit 2. The reason being because while I think they'll be a more powerful unit than a suit of machine armor, I don't think they'll hit anywhere near as hard as an Anchorite. If they have a single attack, I'd imagine it could ignore armor with a +1 dice to wound, but if they have 2 attacks, I think that would be more likely on a 3 dice in melee profile, with a +2 to wound rather than ignoring armor. They would also likely be the slowest moving unit in the faction with a 6-inch move, maybe even a 5, with an armor value of 2 or 3. If they have an armor value of 2, I think they might actually gain the golem keyword to make them more durable, but if they get an armor rating of 3, I think it's more likely they get tough rather than golem. That's it for today, to be honest. That's the end of my speculation on the Temple of Metamorphosis. So what do you think? Will I be close in my estimations, or will I be way off base? Would you like me to revisit this video to see what I got right and what I got wrong when the faction releases? To check out my video on the website and indulge me in more Temple speculation, click the video link to your left. Alternatively, to continue your deep dive into more lore on the channel, click the video link to your right. For discounts on your hobby supplies, check out my affiliate links in the video description, and with that, I'll say thank you for watching, and I'll see you all soon.